Declan Montgomery wiped the sweat from his brow as the afternoon sun bore down on Ashford. The rhythmic clang of tools and hum of machinery filled the air, a sound that had always been comforting to him. For years, this small Appalachian town had been his haven, a place where simplicity reigned and people took pride in hard work. Life hadn't always been easy, but Declan believed in building something lasting, brick by brick, and that's exactly what he thought he had with Adelaide and their son, Connor. His day started like any other, up before dawn, preparing coffee while Adelaide's favorite song hummed faintly from the kitchen radio. Connor sat at the dining table flipping through a comic book, his young face lighting up at every twist in the story. Declan loved these moments, the mundane threads of a life well lived. "Dad, can I come to work with you today?" Connor asked, his hazel eyes sparkling with curiosity. Declan ruffled his son's hair. "Not today, champ, but soon, promise." Adelaide entered the room, her smile as polished as ever, though lately it felt rehearsed. Her blue eyes darted between Declan and Connor, and for a fleeting second a shadow crossed her face. Declan noticed, he always did. He had tried to ignore the small changes, the late nights, the quiet phone calls, the way she seemed to slip out of his reach even when she was sitting right beside him. "Are you working late again tonight?" she asked, her tone neutral. She poured herself a cup of coffee, not bothering to look at him. "Maybe," Declan replied, studying her carefully. "Why?" "No reason, just curious." Her response was clipped, as if she wanted the conversation to end before it began. Declan's chest tightened, but he forced a smile. "We'll have dinner together, though. How about that?" Adelaide didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced at the clock and muttered, "I'll see how my day goes." Connor's cheerful chatter filled the awkward silence as Declan tried to shake off the unease creeping into his mind. For years he had trusted Adelaide implicitly, but something unspoken lingered between them now, like a fog he couldn't clear. By midday, the gnawing doubt had grown stronger. Declan found himself staring out the garage window at the rolling hills, wondering when the distance between them had become so vast. He replayed every moment from the past few weeks, searching for clues, for something that would explain why Adelaide seemed so different. She had been his anchor during his years in the military, his partner through the highs and lows of post-service life. So why did it feel like she was drifting away? The garage phone rang, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Weston Clark, his closest friend and the town's unofficial investigator. "Got a minute, Deck?" Weston's voice was as steady as ever, but there was an edge to it. "Yeah, what's up?" Declan asked, gripping the phone tighter. "I've been meaning to ask, everything okay at home?" Declan froze. Weston wasn't one to pry, but the question hit him like a freight train. "Why do you ask?" "Just heard some things around town. Probably nothing. Forget I said anything." Weston's hesitance only deepened Declan's unease. "Weston," Declan said firmly, "if you've got something to say, spit it out." There was a pause. "Look, I'm not trying to stir the pot, but Adelaide's been seen with someone. A lot." Declan's heart plummeted, his mind racing with possibilities. "Seen with who?" "Don't know for sure. Just thought you should keep your eyes open." The call ended, leaving Declan standing in the empty garage, his head spinning. He wanted to dismiss Weston's words, to chalk it up to small-town gossip. But deep down a part of him already knew the truth. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just in his head. That night, Declan sat alone at the dinner table, the meal he'd prepared growing cold. Adelaide had called to say she'd be late. Again. Connor was asleep upstairs, his quiet breaths the only sound in the house. Declan stared at the empty chair across from him, his chest heavy with a mixture of dread and determination. Whatever was happening, he had to find out. For Connor, for himself, for the life they'd built together. The next few days were a blur for Declan Montgomery. Each morning he rose with the sun, preparing himself for another long day at the garage. But the weight of Weston's words lingered heavily on his mind. Something had shifted. It wasn't just Adelaide's distant glances or the way she pulled away when he reached for her hand. It was the undeniable ache of suspicion clawing at his gut. Friday evening came quicker than he'd expected. The garage was quieter than usual. the hum of machinery replaced by his restless thoughts. Declan finished locking up and headed home, his boots crunching against the gravel path. Ashford's streets were bathed in the dim orange glow of streetlights, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror his unease. As he approached the house, he noticed the living room light flickering faintly through the curtains. Connor was likely upstairs, buried in his books or gaming. But Adelaide's car wasn't in the driveway. She had mentioned dinner with a friend earlier, brushing it off casually, yet there was a sharpness in her tone when he'd asked who she was meeting. Stepping inside, Declan called out, "Connor, you doing okay up there, buddy?" "Yeah, Dad," came the muffled reply from upstairs. Declan smiled faintly, reassured by his son's voice. Still, the house felt colder, emptier somehow. He walked into the kitchen and noticed a note on the counter. It was written hastily, the ink smudged as though the pen had pressed too hard. "Won't be home too late. Don't wait up. Adelaide." The words gnawed at him. Lately, her notes had become more frequent, more detached. He poured himself a glass of water, his hands trembling slightly as he set the glass down. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. Later that night, as the clock struck 11:30, Declan sat on the edge of the couch, his phone in hand. He debated calling her, but stopped himself. She'd likely have an excuse, and he wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. Instead, he opened a messaging app he hadn't used in years. Weston had once told him, "Sometimes the answers are in the details no one thinks you're looking at." And tonight, Declan needed those answers. Scrolling through their shared phone account, Declan's heart sank as he saw the pattern: late-night texts, repeated calls to an unfamiliar number, and gaps in her schedule that she hadn't mentioned. The number wasn't saved in her contacts, but it appeared often enough to spark his suspicions. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat by the living room window watching the empty street, replaying every moment that might have led to this fracture in their lives. His mind drifted to Connor, peacefully asleep upstairs. Whatever this was, Declan knew it wasn't just about him. He had to protect his son from whatever storm was brewing. The next morning, Adelaide returned, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. She paused in the doorway, startled to see Declan awake, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "You're up early," she said, her voice steady but lacking warmth. "Couldn't sleep," he replied, his tone even. He studied her, noting the faint smear of lipstick on her collar and the lingering scent of cologne that wasn't hers. Adelaide shifted under his gaze. "I'm going to shower," she murmured, brushing past him. Declan didn't move. He didn't speak. But as the water ran upstairs, he pulled out his phone and saved the unfamiliar number. He'd give it to Weston later. For now, he'd let Adelaide think he was still in the dark. By Sunday, the pieces were slowly falling into place. Weston called in the afternoon, his tone cautious. "Dec, I think you need to see this." "What is it?" Declan asked, gripping the phone tightly. "I found the guy. His name's Theodore Cromwell, real estate developer. Been in town about a year. Seems like he's been spending a lot of time with Adelaide." Declan's knuckles whitened as he listened. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at the stairs, imagining Connor laughing about something trivial, blissfully unaware of the cracks forming in their family. "I'll call you back," Declan said, hanging up abruptly. He didn't need Weston to say more. The betrayal wasn't just a possibility anymore. It was real, and it was unraveling the very fabric of his life. That evening, Declan sat alone in the darkened living room, the soft glow of Connor's nightlight spilling into the hall. His hands clenched and unclenched as waves of anger, sorrow, and disbelief washed over him. He didn't want to believe it. Not Adelaide. Not the woman he'd built his life with. But the signs were there, glaring and undeniable. He knew what he had to do. Declan Montgomery sat behind the wheel of his truck, the hum of the engine blending with the sound of his thoughts. He had parked a block away from Ashford's finest steakhouse, where Weston had confirmed Adelaide would be meeting Theodore Cromwell tonight. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel, the rhythm erratic, betraying his attempts to stay calm. The hours leading up to this moment had been a haze. Weston's findings were damning. Photos of Adelaide and Theodore laughing at private lunches, walking hand in hand through the town square, smiles that no longer graced his home. Declan's chest burned as he flipped through the images Weston had emailed him. Each photo was a punch to the gut, a cruel confirmation of what he already suspected. Tonight he needed to see it for himself. The restaurant glowed warmly in the crisp evening air, its windows fogged with the promise of fine dining and intimate conversation. Declan remained in the truck, his heart pounding like the echo of distant thunder. He hated himself for being here, for stooping to this level. But he had to know. Adelaide had left home hours ago, dressed in an outfit Declan hadn't seen before. A sleek black dress that clung to her figure in ways that once made his heart skip a beat. "It's a work dinner," she had said, barely glancing at him as she grabbed her coat. Her voice was steady, devoid of the warmth he used to find solace in. Declan didn't respond. He simply nodded, watching her leave with an air of detachment that masked the storm within him. Now, as he sat alone, a mix of dread and determination coursed through his veins. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, Weston's name flashing on the screen. "Deck, they're at table 8 near the back," Weston said quietly. He was already inside, posing as a patron. "It's not good." "What's he doing?" Declan asked, his voice low but strained. "Not much, just sitting there with her, talking. But you can tell, there's something in the way he looks at her, like she's his world." Declan closed his eyes, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The image Weston painted clashed violently with the memories he held dear. Adelaide on their wedding day, her laughter echoing through their first home, the way she cradled Connor as a baby. How had it come to this? "Do you want to come in?" Weston asked cautiously. Declan hesitated. The thought of confronting her now in front of strangers filled him with both rage and regret. "No," he finally said, his voice hollow. "Not yet." But as he hung up, something inside him shifted. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the life they'd built, the son they were raising, and the future that now felt like it was slipping through his fingers. Declan stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching against the gravel as he walked toward the restaurant. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of betrayal itself pressed down on him. Inside, the warmth of the restaurant was suffocating. The hum of conversation and clinking glasses faded into the background as Declan's eyes scanned the room. Then he saw them. Adelaide sat across from Theodore, her posture relaxed, her smile radiant. She looked happy, happier than she had been with him in years. For a moment, Declan froze. The world seemed to tilt, his vision narrowing to the image before him. Theodore leaned in, his hand brushing against Adelaide's. She didn't pull away. Instead, she laughed, a soft, musical sound that once belonged to Declan alone. He took a step closer, his fists clenched at his sides. But before he could reach their table, Weston appeared, blocking his path. "Deck," Weston said firmly, his voice low, "this isn't the time." Declan glared at him, his jaw tight. "Then when, Weston? When is the time?" Weston placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "Soon. But not here. Not like this." Declan's breath came in short, ragged bursts as he fought to regain control. He glanced back at the table, his chest tightening further. Adelaide hadn't noticed him, too engrossed in Theodore's every word. Declan turned abruptly, leaving the restaurant and stepping into the cold night air. Back in his truck, he sat in silence, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. He had seen enough. The truth was no longer a question. It was a knife lodged firmly in his heart. But this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The house was quiet when Declan Montgomery walked in. Too quiet. The kind of silence that lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken words and unresolved tension. Connor was at a friend's house for the weekend, a fact that Declan had insisted upon. Tonight wasn't meant for the innocent ears of his son. Adelaide sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone with an air of practiced indifference. She didn't glance up when Declan entered, but he noticed the way her shoulders tensed ever so slightly. She knew something was coming. "Can we talk?" Declan's voice was calm, though his chest felt like it was on fire. Adelaide's eyes flicked toward him, her expression unreadable. What's this about?" Declan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled a chair from the dining table and set it down across from her, a deliberate act that made her shift uncomfortably. He sat down, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together, his gaze locked onto hers, unwavering. "I know, Adelaide," he said simply. Her reaction was subtle, a slight widening of the eyes, the barest hitch in her breath, but it was enough. She knew exactly what he was talking about. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with caution. Declan leaned back, exhaling sharply. "I know about Theodore Cromwell. I know about the lunches, the late nights, the lies. I know, Adelaide." The words hung in the air like a guillotine poised to drop. For a moment she didn't speak. She just stared at him, her expression wavering between defiance and guilt. "I can explain," she began, but Declan cut her off. "Explain?" he said, his tone sharp. "What is there to explain? I've seen the photos, Adelaide. I saw you with him. I saw how you looked at him, like I don't even exist anymore." Adelaide's composure crumbled, her hands trembling as she set the phone aside. "Declan, it's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," he demanded. His voice cracked, betraying the raw emotion he'd been holding back. "Tell me why the woman I've loved for over a decade, the mother of my son, has been sneaking around with another man. Because I can't figure it out, Adelaide. I can't make sense of it." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said softly. "It wasn't planned. Theo, he made me feel—" "Feel what?" Declan interrupted, his voice rising. "Alive? Seen? Important? And I didn't?" "No!" Adelaide cried, her voice breaking. "It's not like that. You're a good man, Declan, a great father, but somewhere along the way we lost each other. I felt like I was drowning, and Theo, he was a lifeline." Declan stared at her, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. "A lifeline," he repeated bitterly. "So while I was working my ass off to keep this family afloat, you were out finding a lifeline?" "It wasn't about you," Adelaide snapped, her tears falling freely now. "It was about me, about how I felt, about what I needed." "And what about Connor?" Declan shot back. "What about what he needs? A stable home, parents who love each other? Did you even think about him, Adelaide? Or was it all about you?" She flinched at his words, guilt etching deep lines into her face. "Of course I thought about him. I thought about both of you, every single day." "Then why?" Declan's voice cracked again, the pain seeping into every syllable. "Why wasn't that enough?" Adelaide shook her head, unable to answer. The silence that followed was deafening. Declan leaned forward, his elbows on his knees again, his head in his hands. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Do you love him?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Adelaide hesitated, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "I don't know," she admitted. "I care about him, but love, I don't know." Declan lifted his head, his eyes red but resolute. "Then figure it out," he said coldly. "Because whatever this is, whatever we are, it can't go on like this." Adelaide nodded slowly, her face pale. "I'm sorry, Declan. I never wanted to hurt you." "Well, you did," he said flatly, standing up. "And now we deal with the fallout." Declan walked toward the stairs, his heart heavy with the weight of what he'd just heard. As he reached the landing, he stopped, turning back to face her one last time. "For Connor's sake, Adelaide, we keep this civil. But don't expect forgiveness. Not yet." Adelaide nodded again, her tears falling silently as he disappeared upstairs. The house was no longer a home. Declan Montgomery stood in the doorway of Connor's room, his eyes scanning the neatly made bed and the row of action figures lined up along the windowsill. The echoes of laughter and bedtime stories hung in the air like ghosts, reminders of a life that now felt impossibly distant. Connor was staying with Adelaide for the weekend, and the silence in the house was deafening. Declan stepped inside, running his hand over the soft fabric of the quilt he had tucked his son under countless times. He remembered Connor's sleepy voice asking for, "Just one more story, Dad," and the way his little hand clutched Declan's as he drifted off to sleep. Those moments had anchored him, given him purpose. Now they felt like fragments of a dream slipping through his fingers. In the living room, his phone buzzed on the coffee table, jolting him from his thoughts. It was Weston. Declan stared at the screen, his chest tightening. He didn't want to talk, didn't want to explain how the confrontation with Adelaide had unraveled every thread of his life. Instead, he let the call go to voicemail and sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. The weight of it all crashed down on him. The betrayal, the lies, the cold, hollow realization that the woman he had built his world around had chosen someone else. Declan had always prided himself on his resilience, but this was different. It wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the end of the life he thought he knew. Hours passed, the daylight fading into an inky darkness that seeped into every corner of the house. Declan didn't move. He barely registered the passing time, lost in a storm of memories and questions he couldn't answer. When had things gone so wrong? Could he have done something differently? Was it his fault? His thoughts spiraled until a sharp knock at the door broke the silence. Declan jolted upright, his heart racing. He wasn't expecting anyone. Wiping his face with the back of his hand, he stood and crossed the room, opening the door to find Weston standing there, his expression somber. "Dec," Weston said quietly. "I figured you might need some company." Declan opened the door wider, stepping aside to let his friend in. Weston didn't say much. He didn't need to. He simply sat across from Declan, the unspoken understanding between them filling the silence. "Do you think she ever loved me?" Declan asked suddenly, his voice raw. Weston's eyes met his, and for a moment he didn't answer. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think she did. But sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes people lose sight of what really matters." Declan nodded, his throat tightening. I thought we were stronger than this. I thought we could get through anything." "You're stronger than you think, Dec," Weston said firmly. "But you don't have to figure it all out tonight, one step at a time." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of Declan's pain settling between them like a heavy fog. Eventually, Weston stood, clapping a hand on Declan's shoulder. "You're not alone, man, don't forget that." After Weston left, Declan sat by the window, staring out at the quiet street. The moon cast a pale glow over the neighborhood, its light filtering through the trees like faint whispers of hope. Declan closed his eyes, breathing deeply. The road ahead was uncertain, but he knew one thing. He couldn't stay shattered forever. Connor needed him, and if there was one thing Declan knew how to do, it was fight for what mattered. The night stretched on, but for the first time in days, Declan didn't feel entirely consumed by despair. Somewhere in the distance, a new resolve was forming, fragile but steady, a flicker of light in the darkness. The morning light seeped through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. Declan Montgomery sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. The house was quiet, too quiet. Connor was still at Adelaide's, and the absence of his son's laughter weighed heavily on Declan's heart. But this morning felt different. The despair that had consumed him was slowly giving way to something else, determination. Declan pulled out a notebook from the drawer, its pages blank except for a few old sketches of wiring diagrams. He flipped to a fresh page and stared at it for a long moment. Then, with a deep breath, he began to write. Ideas flowed from his mind to the paper. Business plans, goals, steps he needed to take to rebuild his life. His dream of starting an electrical repair business, long buried under the weight of responsibilities, began to take shape again. He remembered the conversations he'd had with Weston about taking control of his future. "Sometimes," Weston had said, "you have to burn down the old to make room for the new." Declan wasn't ready to burn anything just yet, but he was ready to build, slowly, purposefully. By midday, the notebook was filled with scribbled plans and rough timelines. Declan leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. For the first time in weeks, he felt a spark of hope. He could do this, not just for himself, but for Connor. His son deserved a father who was whole, not one consumed by bitterness. Declan picked up his phone and dialed Weston. The line rang twice before his friend answered. "Dec, what's up?" "I need your help," Declan said, his voice steady. "I'm serious about starting that business we talked about. I've got some money saved up, but I'm going to need advice and probably a few connections. Weston chuckled. I knew you'd come around. Let's meet up tomorrow. We'll map it out. That evening, Declan drove to the local library. He spent hours poring over books on small business management and electrical engineering. The quiet hum of the library offered a strange sense of comfort, a reminder that knowledge and progress was within reach. On his way home, Declan stopped at a small diner he hadn't visited in years. The smell of coffee and fresh pie filled the air as he slid into a booth near the window. He was about to order when a familiar voice broke through his thoughts. Declan? He looked up to see Sabrina Langford, a woman he hadn't spoken to since high school. She owned a boutique cafe in town, and her reputation for kindness and resilience preceded her. Sabrina smiled warmly, her eyes filled with curiosity and a hint of concern. Hey, Sabrina, Declan said, gesturing for her to sit. It's been a while. It has, she said, settling into the seat across from him. How have you been? Declan hesitated, then shrugged. Surviving, barely, but I'm working on changing that. Sabrina tilted her head, studying him. You look like a man with a plan. He laughed softly, the sound surprising even himself. Something like that. I'm starting a business. Electrical repair and installations. It's something I've wanted to do for a long time. Her smile widened. That's amazing, Declan. If anyone can pull it off, it's you. They talked for hours, the conversation flowing easily. Sabrina shared stories about her own struggles starting her cafe, the late nights and self-doubt that had plagued her early days. Her words were both inspiring and grounding, a reminder that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be worth it. When Declan finally left the diner, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. Sabrina's encouragement echoed in his mind as he drove home, the stars above Ashford glittering like tiny beacons of hope. As he pulled into the driveway, Declan glanced at the house. It was still the same modest home he'd shared with Adelaide and Connor, but tonight it felt different. It felt like a place where new beginnings were possible. Declan stepped inside, setting his notebook on the counter. Tomorrow, he'd take the first steps toward rebuilding his life, one step at a time. Declan Montgomery wiped his hands on the oil-stained rag he always carried, glancing around the small garage that had quickly become the nerve center of his budding business. The room smelled of solder and fresh paint, the air alive with the faint hum of machines he was repairing. He'd converted this space, the very garage where his old truck had sat idle for years, into a makeshift workshop. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. The journey to this moment had been anything but smooth. Nights spent poring over repair manuals, days spent knocking on doors to hand out flyers. His knees ached from crawling under appliances, and his hands bore the nicks and scrapes of someone who worked tirelessly with tools. But every scar, every drop of sweat had led him here. Declan? Sabrina's voice carried through the open garage door. He turned to see her standing there holding 2 cups of coffee. She smiled as she stepped inside, her presence a welcome reprieve from the chaos of his day. Thought you could use a pick-me-up. You have no idea, Declan replied, accepting the cup and taking a long sip. The warmth spread through him, easing some of the tension he hadn't realized he was holding. You're doing amazing, Sabrina said, her voice filled with genuine admiration as she glanced at the cluttered workbenches and the row of repaired electronics ready for delivery. Do you even realize how far you've come? Declan chuckled softly, shaking his head. It doesn't feel like enough yet. There's still so much to do. Sabrina placed a hand on his arm, grounding him. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither is Montgomery Repairs. But look at you. You're making it happen, one customer at a time. Her words struck a chord, the sincerity in her tone cutting through the self-doubt that often lingered in his mind. Declan nodded, his chest swelling with a mixture of pride and gratitude. Thanks, Sabrina, for everything. Anytime, she said, her smile widening. But don't think this gets you out of buying me dinner later. That evening, after locking up the garage, Declan found himself at Sabrina's cafe. The place was cozy, filled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the faint chatter of patrons. Sabrina had closed early to give them some privacy, and they sat by the window, the town's streetlights casting a soft glow over their table. You know, Sabrina began, stirring her tea thoughtfully. "I think there's a reason why we crossed paths again. Maybe life knew you needed someone to remind you of what you're capable of." Declan looked at her, his expression softening. Or maybe I just got lucky. Their conversation flowed easily, laughter punctuating their words as they shared stories of their journeys. Declan found himself opening up in ways he hadn't before, sharing his fears and aspirations. Sabrina listened intently, her encouragement like a balm to his wounded spirit. By the time he returned home that night, the weight of his struggles felt lighter. He stepped into the living room, his gaze falling on the notebook still open on the coffee table. The plans he'd scribbled weeks ago were slowly becoming a reality, and for the first time, he allowed himself to feel proud of how far he'd come. In the days that followed, word of Montgomery repairs began to spread. Customers praised Declan's attention to detail and fair pricing, and his schedule quickly filled with new appointments. He hired a part-time assistant, an eager high school senior who reminded Declan of himself at that age. Together, they tackled each job with the same dedication that had built his reputation. One evening, as Declan was closing up shop, Connor bounded into the garage, his energy lighting up the room. "Dad, can I help tomorrow? I want to learn how to fix stuff." Declan's heart swelled at the sight of his son's enthusiasm. "Of course, buddy," he said, ruffling Connor's hair. "You're going to be my best apprentice." For the first time in months, Declan felt a sense of stability returning to his life. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was thriving. And though the wounds of betrayal still lingered, they no longer defined him. Declan Montgomery was rising from the ashes, stronger than ever. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the wide windows of Sabrina's cafe, casting a warm glow over the small crowd that had gathered inside. Declan Montgomery sat at a corner table, reviewing a list of upcoming jobs on his tablet. Business had been booming, but his mind was elsewhere today, preoccupied with thoughts of Connor. He missed his son deeply on the weekends Connor spent with Adelaide. It was a lingering ache he had yet to fully reconcile. A soft chime announced a new customer, but Declan didn't look up until he heard a familiar voice, one he hadn't expected to hear again. "Declan?" His head snapped up, and there she was. Adelaide stood just inside the doorway, her expression a mixture of surprise and hesitation. Behind her, clutching a book against his chest, was Connor. Declan's heart lurched at the sight of his son, who grinned and waved excitedly. "Dad!" Connor bolted toward him, wrapping his arms tightly around Declan's waist. The boy's energy was infectious, and Declan couldn't help but smile as he ruffled Connor's hair. "Hey, buddy, what are you doing here?" "We came for hot chocolate," Connor said, his voice muffled against Declan's shirt. "And I wanted to see you." Adelaide approached slowly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked thinner than he remembered, her face drawn and tired. For a moment, they stood in awkward silence, the air thick with unspoken words. "Mind if we join you?" she asked softly. Declan hesitated but gestured to the empty seats across from him. "Go ahead." As Connor chattered away about school and a new video game he was obsessed with, Declan stole glances at Adelaide. She seemed smaller somehow, diminished. Her usual confidence was absent, replaced by something more fragile. It was unsettling to see her this way, and despite everything, he felt a pang of sympathy. When Connor ran off to the counter to order his drink, Adelaide finally spoke. "You look good, Declan. Better than the last time I saw you." He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I've been keeping busy. Work's going well." "I've heard," she said, her voice tinged with something he couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe? "Connor talks about you all the time. He's so proud of you." Declan nodded but didn't respond. He didn't trust himself to speak without the bitterness creeping in. Instead, he focused on the sight of his son laughing with the barista, his happiness a beacon in the heavy moment. Adelaide cleared her throat, drawing his attention back to her. I wanted to say thank you." "For what?" Declan asked, his tone sharper than he intended. "For being there for Connor," she said, her gaze dropping to the table. "He needs you, more than I realized." Declan's jaw tightened. He's always needed me, Adelaide. That hasn't changed. Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time she looked genuinely vulnerable. I know I've made mistakes, more than I can count, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I'm trying to do better. For him. He studied her for a long moment, searching her face for sincerity. There was no denying the weariness in her eyes, the cracks in her once impenetrable armor. Still, the wounds she'd inflicted on him weren't so easily forgotten. You should have thought about that before, Declan said quietly, before all of this. Adelaide flinched but didn't argue. She nodded, accepting his words with a grace that surprised him. Connor returned then, his face glowing with excitement, as he held 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate. Dad, look! They put marshmallows in mine! Declan smiled, his heart softening as he took the mug Connor handed him. Looks great, buddy. For the rest of the afternoon they sat together, sharing stories and laughter. It was almost normal, almost like old times. But the weight of the past lingered, an unspoken reminder that things could never truly go back to the way they were. As they left the cafe, Declan watched Adelaide and Connor walk away, their figures silhouetted against the setting sun. His chest ached with a mix of longing and resolve. He didn't know what the future held, but for now he was content to let this moment stand as a fragile truce, a small step toward healing for all of them. Declan Montgomery wasn't one to seek confrontations, but today wasn't a normal day. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he navigated the familiar streets of Ashford, his mind replaying the call he'd received that morning from Weston. He's back in town, Weston had said simply, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken warnings. Theodore Cromwell, Declan muttered under his breath. The name felt like a splinter lodged deep in his chest. The man who had torn apart his family was back, walking the same streets, breathing the same air. Declan had avoided direct conflict for years, focusing instead on rebuilding his life. But now, fate had placed Theo directly in his path. Declan pulled up outside the new development office on Main Street. The building gleamed, its modern facade a stark contrast to the rustic charm of the town. He stepped out of his truck, his boots striking the pavement with a deliberate weight. Every step toward the glass doors felt heavier than the last, but he wasn't turning back. Not this time. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of new carpet. A young receptionist glanced up, her polished smile faltering slightly under Declan's steely gaze. "I'm here to see Theodore Cromwell," he said firmly. The woman hesitated before nodding. "He's in the conference room. May I let him know you're here?" "No need," Declan replied, already walking past her. The conference room door was slightly ajar, and Declan pushed it open without knocking. Theodore sat at the head of the table, his back to the door. His sleek suit and neatly combed hair screamed wealth and confidence, but Declan noticed the slight tension in his shoulders as he turned to face him. "Well," Theodore began, his tone measured. "This is a surprise." Declan stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind him. "Didn't think you'd show your face here again." Theodore leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but wary. "Business brought me back. Not everything's about you, Montgomery." Declan's jaw tightened, the urge to lash out nearly overwhelming. But he'd promised himself he wouldn't lose control. Not here. Not now. "Business," he repeated, his voice low. "Is that what you called it when you dismantled my family?" Theodore sighed, folding his hands on the table. "Look, I'm not here to dredge up the past. I made mistakes, you don't need to tell me that. But I've moved on." Declan took a step closer, his eyes locked on Theodore's. "Moved on? You destroyed my marriage, stole time with my son, and now you think you can walk back into this town like nothing happened?" Theodore's calm facade cracked, irritation flashing in his eyes. "I didn't steal anything, Declan. Adelaide made her choices. She wasn't happy with you. That's not my fault." Declan's fists clenched at his sides, his breathing heavy. "You think that absolves you? You think just because you were the shiny new thing, it erases the damage you caused?" Theodore stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "I don't owe you an apology. You want someone to blame? Look in the mirror. Maybe if you'd been a better husband, she wouldn't have come to me." The words hit like a gut punch, but Declan didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice dangerously calm. "You can spin it however you want, Cromwell, but I'll tell you this, you might have had her for a while, but I'm the one who's still standing, and I'll always be there for Connor, something you'll never understand." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension crackling like static electricity. Then Theodore broke eye contact, turning toward the window. "You've got your life, I've got mine. Let's leave it at that." Declan shook his head, a bitter smile playing on his lips. "You don't get to decide how this ends. You made your choices, Theo. Now live with them." Without waiting for a response, Declan turned and walked out, the weight in his chest finally starting to lift. He had faced the man who had caused so much pain, and though the anger still simmered, it no longer controlled him. This wasn't about Theodore anymore. This was about Declan and the life he was building, stronger and steadier than before. As he stepped into the sunlight, Declan took a deep breath, his shoulders squaring. He had confronted his nemesis, and for the first time in years, he felt free. The sound of Connor's laughter echoed through the small workshop as Declan adjusted a circuit board under the bright light of his desk lamp. Connor sat nearby, spinning on a stool, a gleam of joy in his eyes that Declan hadn't seen in years. It was a simple moment, father and son working together, but for Declan, it was everything. "Can I try this one, Dad?" Connor asked eagerly, holding up a small screwdriver. Declan chuckled, handing him the device. "Go for it, buddy. Just be careful with the wiring." The boy's concentration was fierce, his tongue sticking out slightly as he mirrored the patience Declan had spent years cultivating. Watching him, Declan felt a deep sense of pride and gratitude. Gratitude that despite everything, he hadn't lost this connection with his son. The ringing of the shop phone interrupted the moment. Declan glanced at the caller ID and hesitated. It was Adelaide. He let out a slow breath before answering. "Hey." "Hi, Declan." Her voice came through softly, tentative. "I know this is last minute, but can we talk? It's about Connor." Declan's heart tightened, but he kept his tone steady. "Sure. When?" "I can come by tonight after I drop him off," she offered. "All right," Declan said, his stomach churning. "See you then." When Adelaide arrived that evening, Declan was waiting on the porch. The sun was setting behind her, casting her figure in shadow. As she approached, he noticed the nervous way she fidgeted with the strap of her purse, a habit he hadn't seen in years. "Thanks for meeting with me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Declan nodded, gesturing toward the chairs on the porch. "What's on your mind?" Adelaide hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I've been thinking a lot about the past few years, everything I've done, and I need to say something I should have said a long time ago." Declan's chest tightened as he watched her struggle with her words. Part of him wanted to stop her, to spare himself the pain of hearing it all over again. But another part, one he hadn't been ready to face until now, needed to hear it. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice cracking. "I'm so sorry for what I did to you, to us, to our family. I was selfish, and I hurt you in ways I can never take back." Declan looked away, his jaw tightening as the weight of her apology settled over him. For years he had imagined this moment, rehearsed what he would say, but now that it was here, he found himself at a loss. "Why now?" he asked, his voice rough. "Why say this now, after everything?" Adelaide's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "Because I see it now, what I threw away, and I see how much Connor needs you, how much better he is because of you. I needed you to know. I regret it, all of it." The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Declan's mind raced with memories, both good and bad. He thought of the family they had once been, the life they had built together, and the ways it had unraveled. Forgiveness had always felt impossible, a bridge too far to cross. But sitting here, seeing the raw vulnerability in her eyes, something inside him began to shift. "I can't forget what happened," Declan said slowly. "But maybe I can forgive. Not for you. For me. For Connor." Adelaide's breath hitched, her relief palpable. "Thank you," she whispered. "That's more than I deserve." Declan nodded, the weight he had carried for so long lifting ever so slightly. He didn't know what the future held for them, but this was a start, a step toward healing, toward letting go of the pain that had defined him for far too long. As Adelaide stood to leave, she paused at the top of the steps. "Declan, I hope you find happiness. You deserve it." Declan watched her walk away, her figure fading into the twilight. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of peace. He turned back toward the house, where Connor's laughter still lingered in the air. There was still so much to rebuild, but tonight the foundations had been laid. Declan Montgomery pulled into the driveway of Adelaide's small townhouse, his heart pounding in his chest. The winter chill crept through the window as he shut off the truck's engine, exhaling slowly. Tonight was about Connor. Not about the past, not about old wounds, but about giving his son the family connection he so clearly craved. He grabbed the gift bag from the passenger seat, its weight feeling heavier than it should. Inside was a book, Connor's favorite superhero anthology, one Declan had saved up to buy when money was tighter. He hoped it would be the perfect peace offering for the dinner Adelaide had invited him to. The door opened before he could knock, and Connor stood there beaming. "Dad, you're here!" Declan smiled, ruffling his son's hair as he stepped inside. The warmth of the house wrapped around him, the scent of roasted chicken filling the air. Adelaide appeared in the doorway to the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. She looked surprised, but genuinely pleased. "Hey," she said softly. "Thanks for coming." "Wouldn't miss it," Declan replied, his voice steady but distant. He wasn't here for her. He was here for Connor. The dinner table was small but carefully set, with mismatched plates and a vase of flowers in the center. It reminded Declan of their early years together, when they had been young and struggling but full of hope. The memory tugged at something deep inside him, but he pushed it aside. Connor couldn't contain his excitement, launching into stories about school and his friends as they ate. Declan listened intently, laughing at his son's animated descriptions. For a moment, the tension between him and Adelaide seemed to fade, replaced by the shared joy of watching their son thrive. After dinner, while Connor was upstairs getting ready for bed, Declan and Adelaide lingered at the table. The silence between them was thick, but not uncomfortable. Finally, Adelaide spoke. "I'm glad you came tonight," she said, her fingers tracing the edge of her glass. "Connor's been talking about it all week." Declan nodded, his gaze fixed on the table. "He needs this. He needs to see us getting along." Adelaide hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I know it's a lot to ask, but I'd like us to do more of this. For him." Declan looked up, his eyes meeting hers. There was a vulnerability there, a sincerity that was hard to ignore. "It's not just about showing up for dinner," he said, his voice firm but calm. "If we're going to do this, we have to mean it. We can't let him think it's a temporary fix." "I know," Adelaide said quickly. "I'm not asking for miracles, Declan. I want to build something better. For him, for all of us." Declan leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words settling over him. He had spent so much time guarding his heart, protecting himself from the pain she had caused. But tonight, watching Connor's happiness, he realized that forgiveness wasn't just about letting go of the past. It was about creating a future worth living for. "All right," he said finally. "But it's going to take work. And it's not about us. It's about making sure Connor knows he's loved, no matter what." Adelaide nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered. When Connor came back downstairs, he found his parents sitting side by side on the couch, flipping through the superhero anthology together. His face lit up as he climbed onto the couch between them, his laughter filling the room. For the first time in years, Declan felt a sense of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but tonight they had taken a step forward. Together, the crisp morning air carried a hint of spring as Declan Montgomery stood on the porch of his modest home, watching the sun rise over Ashford. A cup of freshly brewed coffee warmed his hands, but it was the quiet peace in his heart that truly comforted him. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a dark unknown. It felt like a promise. Behind him, the sound of laughter echoed through the house. Connor's excitement was infectious as he ran from room to room, proudly showing Sabrina the small repairs he'd helped Declan make over the past few weeks. "Dad and I fixed that chair," Connor exclaimed, pointing to the dining room set. "And I helped with the toolbox, too." Declan smiled as he stepped inside, leaning against the doorway to watch them. Sabrina knelt beside Connor, her face lit with genuine admiration as she listened to his enthusiastic explanations. Her presence had become a steady anchor in their lives, a source of light that Declan hadn't realized he needed until she was there. Connor's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Dad, are we still going to the park today? You promised." Declan chuckled, setting his coffee cup on the counter. "Of course we are, but only if you finish your chores first." Connor groaned dramatically but grinned as he ran off to tackle the list they had written together that morning. Sabrina stood, brushing off her jeans, her eyes meeting Declan's with a knowing smile. "You're doing an amazing job with him," she said softly, crossing the room to stand by his side. "He's so happy. You both are." Declan looked at her, his expression growing serious. "I couldn't have done it without you, Sabrina. You've been there for us in ways I can't even begin to explain." She reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "You didn't need me to make this happen, Declan. You already had it in you. I just helped remind you." Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Declan's chest tightened slightly as he recognized the familiar figure stepping out of the vehicle. Adelaide. She carried a small bag in her hand, her movements hesitant as she approached the porch. Connor burst through the door, his face lighting up. "Mom!" Adelaide knelt to embrace him, her eyes lifting to meet Declan's. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a fragile truce built on the shared love they had for their son. "I brought his favorite snacks for the park," Adelaide said, holding up the bag. Her voice was warm but cautious, as if testing the boundaries of their new dynamic. Declan nodded, his posture relaxed. "Thanks, he'll love that." For a moment, the three of them stood there, connected by the thread of family that refused to break despite everything. Connor ran ahead to load his bag into the truck, his laughter floating back to them. "Thank you for letting me be a part of this," Adelaide said quietly. "I know it hasn't been easy." Declan's gaze softened. "It's what's best for him. That's what matters." As Adelaide stepped back toward her car, Sabrina joined Declan on the porch, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "You okay?" she asked, her voice filled with gentle concern. He nodded, exhaling deeply. "Yeah, I think we're finally getting it right." Later that day, as they sat on a picnic blanket under the shade of a tall oak tree, Connor's laughter filled the air. Sabrina leaned against Declan's shoulder, her presence a steady comfort, while Adelaide sat nearby, cheering as Connor showed off his new soccer moves. For the first time, Declan saw not just the fractured pieces of his past, but the beautiful mosaic of his present. Life wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was full, vibrant, and worth every moment of struggle that had brought him here. A new chapter had begun, not just for him, but for all of them. And this time it felt like the beginning of something extraordinary. What do you think of Declan Montgomery and his journey of resilience and forgiveness? From which region are you watching this video? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And be sure to check out more heartwarming tales by clicking here on the end screen. See you in the next story.